Judge Morey has served the district court bench from 1999. She received her undergraduate degrees from Millikan University in Illinois and received a master's in teaching from Reed College and her JD from Northwestern. Prior to serving the district court bench, Judge Morey was an Olympic swimmer and coach, journalist, and assistant district attorney for the 14th Judicial District. Judge Morey is an advocate for juveniles and presides over delinquency court. In 1997, Morey was appointed to a task force that produced the Juvenile Justice Reform Act, a major rewrite of the state's juvenile code. Of the task force 42 recommendations, 41 were adopted. Morey helped launch the first misdemeanor diversion program in Durham. Teenagers who successfully complete the program have their charges dropped. The misdemeanor diversion program has a 98% success rate. Of the 125 youths who have passed through it, only 2 were not successful. And last year, the program expanded to include nonviolent offenders between the ages of 18 and 21. Judge Morey is currently in running to fill the North Carolina House of Representatives seats for District 30. Senator Terry Van Duyn is also joining us today. Terry Van Duyn is a Democratic member of the North Carolina State Senate representing District 49. She was appointed to the chamber on April 3rd, 2014 by the Executive Committee of the Bucombe County Democratic Party. Van Duyn currently serves as Democratic Minority Whip in the state Senate. For the past 20 years, Senator Van Duyn has been a tireless advocate for working families in Bucombe County. She has served on the Community Foundation's of WNC Distribution Committee, chaired the board for legal services, and volunteered as a healthcare navigator under the Affordable Care Act. She also advocates to prevent the defunding of public schools. In April 2016, Van Duyn introduced a bill in the state Senate to repeal HB 2. We're also joined. We're also joined by Sarah Preston, who serves as executive directors of Lillian's List, a statewide community working to recruit, train, promote, and support pro-choice progressive women running for public office. Since the inception of Lillian's List in 1997, the organization has helped elect 47 candidates to the General Assembly and 4 to the Council of State. Prior to joining Lillian's List, Preston spent almost a decade as a policy director at the American Civil Liberties Union of North Carolina. She has experience advocating for reproductive freedom and working with policymakers at the state and local level. Her experience interning for the only female member of the Democratic Senate caucus in Iowa cemented her commitment to promoting women in leadership positions in politics. Thanks for joining us today.
And I'm just going to introduce myself because I asked you. My name is Sonia Linton. I'm an attorney here in Durham. I have a trust and estates firm downtown. More importantly for today, I am the chair of the Government Action Committee for the North Carolina Association of Women Attorneys. And just for all you law students, it's free for law students. And we'd love to have more representation of law students because I think it's a great place to network and to learn about what it's like to be a lawyer in North Carolina. I am also a committee chair for the Durham Orange Women Attorneys Women in Politics Subcommittee. So I am very excited and honored to be seated here with these talented individuals. It's particularly poignant for me because I was actually a career counselor here at Duke Law with Ms. Kaplan over there. And so I feel like it's a really great synergy between the law schools and getting to know a little bit more about, our elected representatives and North Carolina government in general. So I'm just going to start out with a question. I'd like each of you in turn, if you could, to answer. I'd just love to hear a little bit more about your personal stories and particularly what got you involved in advocacy and public life in general. Judge Morey?
Wow.
Oh, sorry.
First of all, I got to say, you all are the quietest eaters I've ever not heard. I'm looking out and I'm seeing everyone. I don't hear a sound. Anyway, we're really thrilled to be here. And we hope it becomes informal and you ask us questions and whatever. What was the question? What got us started? I mean,
just
more
bit
about ourselves. I fell into my job. When I was in law school, it was the last day of classes and had no idea what I was going to do. And, everyone else kind of knew they were going to New York, they're getting an interview, doing something. So I was at the bike rack ready to ride my bike home from law school. And I overheard this girl saying, I have an interview in 2 days at the NCAA. and they're going to hire the first female investigator to travel nationwide to look into college recruiting and cheating. And she just went on and on and on. Well, what did I do? I pedaled home. I got on the phone, 1-800-NCAA, called. Hi, I'm Marcia Morey. I'm just graduating from University of Illinois Law School, and I was an Olympic swimmer, and I hear you're interviewing. Guess what? I went out in 2 days and got the job. So, if you hear something, don't let everyone else know about it. So that was my first job out of law school. And, getting into that, really started looking at ethics in athletics, laws, rules, recruitment, and brought me down to the Triangle and Durham and Chapel Hill, where I finally came down and started in as an assistant district attorney. Once again, walking into a criminal courtroom, never having been in a criminal courtroom the first day and having 200 cases in front of me. So for those of you who don't know your precise career path, things will happen, they will unfold. But I'll tell you, the one thing you have to have, whatever you do, is passion. I developed a passion for juvenile justice because I saw kids coming into court charged with offenses from murder to truancy. But the problems they had, the families they came from, what society should do to help them. The more I learned, the more it fed my fuel to make a change and make a difference. So here I am, 18 years later, still as a judge, now the Chief District Court Judge, as excited every day to go in that courtroom as I was 18 years ago. So I hope you all find that. Thank you.
We have something in common. I graduated from the University of Illinois as well, but I graduated with a double major in sociology and economics, and actually went to work as a computer programmer. So I am not an attorney, but I have great respect for attorneys. But what happened was I moved to Asheville, North Carolina, about 25 years ago. My son was in 3rd grade, and we knew he was going to have trouble in school. I had him extensively evaluated in Houston, and eventually they diagnosed him as being ADD because he responded to Ritalin. And so I moved to Asheville. I've got all my evaluations. I go into his grammar school, loaded for bear. But what happened was he had the good fortune of being placed in a classroom with a teacher who immediately knew what his problem really was. And it was so obvious to her that she thought I was keeping it a secret. But I was volunteering in her classroom, and eventually she took me aside and asked me if I'd ever had him evaluated for autism. Well, needless to say, that changed our lives because he is, in fact, on the autism spectrum. And I got very involved with the autism community and served on the state board of the North Carolina Autism Society. And what I learned there was that his diagnosis was made possible by a group of parents that went to the General Assembly and said, we have a crisis in North Carolina with children in this state who have autism and are not getting what they need at school. They got funding for something called Division Teach. And everywhere there is a branch of the University of North Carolina, there is a Division Teach, and they do outreach to teachers. So what I came to understand is the importance of advocacy in terms of public policy. And so I had also volunteered at a number of nonprofits in Asheville, and I advocated for them to do advocacy. And through that, I met a number of politicians. Eventually, they asked me to run. And I ran for county commissioner, came in last. It was also how I met Lillian's List, and I did some service on their board. But when Senator Nesbitt passed away, very suddenly, it was just after my run for county commissioner, and my husband said, when are you going to have an opportunity to have a 2-week campaign? So I had already done all this work for county commissioner and just kind of walked in the door and ran for Sarah Nesbitt's position and was fortunate enough to win. So, so very different routes, but I think the other common denominator is passion, because I saw how an investment in autism through our public schools totally changed my life and the lives of so many people that I met while I was working through the Autism Society, and I just wanted to be part of that.
Awesome. Can everyone hear me okay? I've been given this little lapel mic. I want to make sure all right. So I started out in college. Really, I was studying history and the Constitution and sort of became really interested and engaged around that and decided I would go to law school. But I entered law school not really knowing what I wanted to do. So if any of you out there are still struggling with that, that's okay, don't worry. You'll figure it out. So I was going to Drake University, which is in Des Moines, Iowa, and it's one of the few schools that has a legislative practice certificate where you can actually sort of train to go into policy work. And one of the things that they require is that you intern both with a state senator or state representative, but also with a lobbyist. And so I interned with the only woman senator in the Iowa Senate at the time, Amanda Reagan. And she was a really interesting person. She was a Democrat from a very rural district, sort of more conservative district than she personally was. And so what I learned from her, I think, were two things. One, picking your battles, and two, really being representative of your constituents, even when you don't fully agree with your district. And those were very important lessons for me to learn on that track. I then went to work to intern for the ACLU of Iowa, and that was sort of when I found my passion. I really just was so impressed with the way in which the ACLU stayed committed to its principles and never deviated from that. And because of that, they were, I would say, uniformly on the right side of every single issue, in my opinion. So I loved that work, and I interned for both their legal director and their legislative director in Iowa. And when I came to the end of my law school career, I was looking around for a position, and my mentor at the ACLU of Iowa started sending me every single posting for any ACLU affiliate. There are 53 in the country. So it ranged from, administrative assistant to executive director, which I was like, I don't think they're going to make me the executive director of the California affiliate right out of law school, but okay. So I did apply for almost every single one of them, and North Carolina was the first affiliate to offer me a job. So I came out here. I was the policy coordinator at the time. I was the only person doing policy work for the ACLU of North Carolina back in 2007. And I feel incredibly privileged to have been able to do that for a decade. I think about 4 or 5 years in, the control in our state legislature switched from entirely Democratic to entirely Republican. And it was like learning a whole new job. So in that way, it was really interesting and exciting. I never got bored, but definitely tactics and sort of what was going on in the legislature changed so dramatically halfway through that it really did feel like a brand new job and a completely different place to work. And I, continued to try and find ways to be effective, to build relationships. I think that's a lot of what goes into policy work, but I also came to the conclusion somewhere in there that if we were going to get better policy for our people, for North Carolina, we were going to need some better policy makers. And Lillian's List offered me the opportunity to be involved in that side of the work and getting those better policymakers in place so that they can get us the policies that we need. So I come at this work very much from the perspective of people like Terry and maybe Marcia soon in the legislature are there to make good policy. So even though we're not, Lillian's List is very much about recruiting candidates and training them to run for office, the end goal is always to have the very best policy for our people. It's to make sure that our state is the best place to live. It's to make sure that we're being fair, that we're instituting justice fairly, that we're treating our people the same regardless of race, ethnicity, religion. So those are the kinds of principles that I believe in and that I bring to my work in recruiting and training, and that's kind of what I look for when I'm looking to women that we can support and recruit and bring to office. So I think it's a real privilege to be able to do this work and to try and find those women, and a lot of them come to us, so we don't have to go out and find them, especially since the election. But it's a real privilege to be able to go and help these amazing women who believe in those same things fight for their office, because it is a fight and it's an act of courage to run.
That's great. So I'm going to pick up on something Sarah just said, so I'm going to start with you this time. Can you talk a little bit about the specific obstacles for women running for office, especially at the state level, and maybe especially in North Carolina?
I would say that the obstacles kind of range, but the biggest obstacle for anyone running for office, but this affects women disproportionately, is actually incumbency. So once somebody gets elected and becomes an incumbent legislator, it's much easier for them to get reelected. They have the benefit of incumbency. Well, of course, like everywhere, every probably job as well, men have dominated. So they're the incumbents, and they have that benefit of incumbency running again and again, and it's harder for women to break in to the field. And that, I mean, I could be talking about probably most fields, but so politics is just like anything else. It's, women have to work harder, they have to jump higher, they have to break into a field that's been dominated by men for decades. But I think there are other things that come up for women. What we found with a lot of our candidates is that they're making decisions based on family care, because women are more affected by what they sometimes call the second shift. Women are often the primary caregiver for children, if they have them, and they therefore make decisions about running for office based on whether they're going to be able to get home in time to look after their child, or whether they're going to be able to provide some other kind of child care. And that does affect women disproportionately and differently from men. Some other things, I actually don't think that voting affects, that voters actually have a bias, but I think women perceive a bias. What we've found is that women actually, when they run, win at the same rate as men. So the voters don't have a bias going into the voting booth, but oftentimes they think that there will be some kind of gender bias against them, so they make the decision not to run because it might be too hard, it might take too much time. We've also found that women, again, this is sort of a broader societal issue, when you look at women in the workforce, are disproportionately in careers where they don't have good fundraising networks. Caregiving, teachers, disproportionately women, nurses, there are other professions, and that's changing, and I think it'll continue to change, and this will not be, hopefully won't be an issue in 10 years, but right now it is an issue where, if you're a teacher and you're coming out of that background, you're not gonna have a network of wealthy donors that you can tap into. And the reality is that candidates do have to tap into their existing network, and we often advise that if you can raise 50 to 70% of your campaign funds from your network, that's going to be a real benefit to you, but it's not completely necessary. So the other thing that we want our women to understand is we can teach you to fundraise, and in fact, the women that go through Lillian's List fundraising often become the most competitive fundraisers in the state and out-fundraise their male counterparts. So that shouldn't be a barrier, but I think for women, they often think about that as a barrier. Like they don't have a network that exists, so they don't know how they're going to build one, but that's something they can learn. So that's just a sampling of some of the obstacles, but I think there are probably many, many more that I'm not even thinking of off the top of my head, but those I think are the primary ones that come up for us for women.
She's absolutely right. One thing that I would add at the state legislature level is that because I live in Asheville, that's about 4 hours away from Raleigh. So that means I am in Raleigh away from my family 4 days out of the week. And I could not have done that when I was raising a family. So, timing, I think, is a lot trickier for women, at least women who are interested in raising children. The other thing, though, I was doing a little research on this whole issue, and one of the things I found that was interesting is that women are less likely to support other women with checks. Okay, that they'll vote for us, but they're more hesitant to support us financially. That's just not how they see their role, and we need to stick together because, unfortunately, running for election is getting more and more expensive all the time. So I just want to plant that seed. Timing is everything. I was not interested in politics until I was in my mid-50s. So I understand now is not the time for you all to be writing checks, but if you get passionate about a candidate, that's part of that passion.
And I'm in a somewhat different position. District court judges are nonpartisan, so no one knows who your party is. And you either get there by being appointed by the governor or running for office. In Durham, we have 4 of our 7 judges are women. So that's kind of nice. We have a nice split racially. I mean, we're a very, very diverse bench. So I haven't entered in yet to the elected arena and fought for the money, but I'm considering a big step. I am in a safe seat. I have 2 more years on my 5th term. I can run for another one probably. I've never been opposed. So being, in the ground, really duking it out and raising money is new, but I am a competitor. And I think the way our country is and where our state is, that we all need to wake up. I mean, life as we have known it has changed dramatically. And every day there's something almost astounding that we are reading in the news. I'm trying to be politically correct and honor, and listen to other people, but I think it's a very scary time. And I think we are where we are, and in part, we didn't get enough young voters out to vote. That was one of the first. The young people from the age, 18 to 25, the results of the turnout was they are asleep. And we have got to wake up, and we have got to let everyone see every day these decisions are going to affect our lives. So, anyway.
Yeah. Well, that leads really nicely into the next subject, which is, I would love to see if we can kind of explore a little bit more substantive issue. What you see, whether it be as a woman or just as your position right now, what we should be thinking about in terms of North Carolina specifically that's happening in Raleigh right now. Why don't we start? Yeah? Oh, Terry, you haven't started yet. I'm sorry.
No, that's quite right.
Sorry.
One of the things that concerns me most is this cultural divide. And I'll start by saying that when they gerrymandered to neuter Democratic votes, I believe they also neutered urban votes. And so to a certain extent, this urban-rural thing is a little bit artificial. We're all interrelated. However, what I have seen in my now 4 years in the General Assembly is the use of social issues to divide us in a way that is not helpful for the state of North Carolina, particularly around women's issues. We have a totally heinous anti-abortion bill that's already been introduced in the state legislature. There's pretty much been one of those every year that I've been there. HB2 is a culmination. To this point, it's a culmination. Who knows what's going to be next? Before HB2, there was the magistrate's bill. Before the magistrate's bill, there was Amendment 1. And regardless of how you feel about these issues, I think it's clear to me anyway that if we divide the state based on male or female, or LGBT versus non-LGBT, or urban versus rural. We are not doing the state's business. And issues like education, issues like, that is right in their wheelhouse, economic development, have suffered terribly over the last 3 years. We did not fund economic development to the level that we had in the past because we were taken off on these social issues. And clearly, in my opinion, that is not good for our future. We have got some serious issues facing us, and I was doing a little research. I was asked in March to speak to a group on domestic violence. And you would have thought that that was something we would all agree on, and with the president's announcement that he is going to try to defund the Violence Against Women's Act, I mean, in an environment where defunding the Violence Against Women's Act is politically acceptable, I am very, very concerned that this cultural war is going to ramp up, and it gets us nowhere. It gets us absolutely nowhere other than backwards. So thank you for being engaged.
Do you want to get?
I would say the issues, I went to the march in Raleigh on Saturday. Any of you go? Where were you? Someone had a sign and they said, this sign isn't big enough to list all the issues. And everywhere you looked, it was, repeal HB2, it is Planned Parenthood, it's expand Medicare, it's families first, it's education, check charter schools. I mean, everything seems to be in play at issue. I'm answering a questionnaire now to get this House seat, and they said, list in order of your top 7 issues that you feel are most important for the state right now. And my response is, I cannot rank them in order of 1 to 7. But here are the biggest issues I see, and they go from climate change to expansion of Medicaid. I am big on raise the age of juvenile jurisdiction. How many of you are from North Carolina? Okay, most of you are from out of state. Do you all know that North Carolina has the youngest age of criminal jurisdiction in the country? That I have people standing in front of me in a courtroom who have been charged with littering at the age of 16, and they get a citation, and they don't know what it means, and they throw it away, and the police go to their high school and they take them out in handcuffs to the magistrate for failing to come to court on a littering citation. And a criminal record stays with you almost forever. Even for littering, you have been charged with a crime. Wait till you take your, bar exam. They're gonna ask you, have you ever been charged with a crime? Convicted of a crime? Well, North Carolina, I am a big proponent. We need to raise the age like every other state to at least 18. We have to stop criminalizing our youth. So I get very passionate about it. But I agree with Terry. I mean, the gerrymandering, there is a movie out that, I don't know if it's been shown at Duke.
Democracy for Sale.
Yeah, Democracy for Sale. And it shows one of our state senators in Fayetteville showing the district when she was elected. And then in 2010, when they redistrict, they went down surgically her street, put her on this side of a new district, not where all her neighbors and surrounding people were, to get her out of office. And they succeeded. So redistricting is fundamental. We have to do it, and we have to do it fairly. It should be a nonpartisan committee at the state level to do this. Get the law school deans, get someone nonpartisan, take politics out of it. Climate change is huge. What's happening federally and locally? I had court today. I had a young Hispanic kid. Where was his mother? Guess what? His mother was deported this weekend. She wasn't a criminal. That child stood in my courtroom without a mother today. So these things affect us. Wake up, be passionate. Your turn, Sarah.
Thank you. Well, I'll talk generally, since I no longer work in the legislature, and I'm grateful for that. Sorry. I support our women who do.
Yes, she does.
But what I saw generally as a trend over the last, 6 years now was this idea of grouping together the other and then targeting them. That was essentially what was going on under the current leadership. So you had grouping of immigrants, and then you had literally every session a bill move, and two at least of the last 3 sessions, a bill pass to target immigrants in a way that Marcia was describing, to try and sweep up undocumented immigrants in particular, but also target really any immigrant or Latino individual for increased interaction with the government. And then you saw targeting of women, grouping women together and targeting them, and that was every single session we saw some horrible bill get passed, not just get considered, but actually get passed by this legislature, that I think what it really amounts to is undermining the ability and sort of the trust in women to make decisions. So even if you don't really agree fully with the policies of, a Planned Parenthood or Lillian's list, if you don't know for sure that you're fully pro-choice, or you're not sure what that even really means, the reality of these bills is that they're crafted by men, they're offered by men, they're passed by majority men to try and undermine the ability of women to make decisions about their bodies as a way of undermining the decision-making capacity and the trust that we have in women in our society. And so obviously I find that horribly offensive, as you can probably tell from my description. So that we also had plenty of bills that targeted African American individuals in different ways. The most recent example, one that sort of incensed communities of color, was a body cam bill that denied people from the ability to actually view police body cam footage without having to go to court. It was a very difficult bill because I don't think it was well explained and it was somewhat nuanced. But that was one example that I think for communities of color that were dealing with police shootings and police violence really hit home for them. But there were others, and at the beginning of my tenure there were these street gang bills that kept coming up that were really about targeting communities of color, and particularly young African American men. So this is the trend, and I think that voting rights has a lot to do with it. I think nonpartisan redistricting has a lot to do with it, because at the end of the day we don't have a legislature that's representative of our state. We have less than 25% of our legislators are women, but 54% of the electorate is women. We have no Latinos in our legislature. We have very few LGBT people in our legislature. It's very easy to attack a community when you don't have to look them in the eye and explain to them on the floor why it is that you're doing this to them and to their community and their family. And so I think that's really voting rights, and gerrymandering is probably at the bottom of all of this, and it's why you see no desire in the current leadership to have nonpartisan redistricting, but it's also why you see constant attacks on voting rights, constant barriers to people accessing the ballot.
Can I say a little about?
Yes, please.
Because one of the pushbacks I get when I talk about nonpartisan redistricting is, isn't turnabout fair play? Okay, the Democrats were able to do it for an awfully long time. Isn't it sour grapes? And I think it's important to point out that this is not our grandfather's redistricting. All right, that what we have now is we have big data and we have big computers. And prior to that, all we had was voter registration records, which in North Carolina, given that about a third of the population registers as unaffiliated, doesn't tell you a whole lot. But if you can look at an address and know that Field and Stream magazine goes to that address, you can make some assumptions about how those folks are going to vote. And that's where we are now. And this partisan redistricting has gotten so precise that, for example, in 2012, 60% of the votes for Congress went to Democrats, and 70% of the seats went to Republicans. That, to me, means that we are not representative of our electorate. exactly what Sarah said. But even more insidious, in this last election, in the state legislature, almost 50% of us ran unopposed. Okay, if I have no opposition, and I know I am in a totally safe seat, I don't even have to go home. I mean, I can totally take my constituents for granted. And that's also not very democratic. I think if this were happening in a third world country, we would have a fit. But it's happening right here in North Carolina. That is how efficiently our districts have been drawn.
So I want to open this up to Q&A time. But I also just want to, because I really am not usually this silent. This has been a real struggle for me this entire time. Jennifer knows. But I just want to say, like, you know, you guys are getting to see 3 different, you know, aspects of the law right now. We have a judge, we have a state senator, and we have a lobbyist, and, or previous lobbyist, I suppose, sorry. And you all are learning the law right now. This is how it actually affects people. And coming, I mean, you know, the ivory tower is often decried, but this is how it actually comes into people's lives. And I think it's amazing that you all are studying law, and I think you'll do great things. I hope you will. And I hope that you think about, you know, what role the politics are and how it really plays into people's lives. But I would like to offer it up to y'all. Don't be shy. Raise your hands. Otherwise, you're going to have to hear another one of my questions. And, you know, please.
So I'm from Maryland originally, but my family in North Carolina, we have a lot of connections here, and I'm not going to end up here after graduation. But one of the things I've noticed that I thought was interesting is that the University of Maryland School of Law actually plays a lot of active role in politics in the state, and like will take on cases on behalf of the state and the city, and like, you know, really devote its resources. And I was just wondering, kind of, have North Carolina law schools been active in that regard? And if not, would you welcome that?
Absolutely. And, you know, the clinics are tremendous. I mean, you have a great educational law clinic here with Jane Weddick. North Carolina UNC Chapel Hill has a very good juvenile justice clinic. NCCU has a family justice clinic, and they come in. Getting that courtroom experience, 3rd-year practice, is wonderful. But, you know, I was struck over in Raleigh, and I didn't see all the 15,000 people. But, you know, protests and marches used to be led on college campuses. And you don't see that as much anymore. And, you know, I was looking around. Where are Duke students? I mean, there were some, especially medical center people were there. But, you know, movements used to really start at the college campuses. And I hope that gets reinvigorated.
I don't really have a whole lot to add other than it feels right now that this legislature is, let's just say retribution is swift and it is fierce. And I wonder if that doesn't have a chilling effect, particularly on our state universities, but even Duke. I'm sure there are financial interconnections between Duke Law School and the General Assembly. And that's truly unfortunate, but I know when I go into grammar schools that teachers are afraid to speak out. So I can imagine if you are at UNC and a significant amount of the law school's budget has got to somehow be related to the General Assembly, that it would be difficult. So we are a state, I believe, out of balance. And we need desperately to rebalance.
Yeah, and I don't think I have much to add to that, except that I do know when reproductive rights bills have come up in the past, we've seen medical schools step up to talk about, there was one bill actually last year that had a training component where they were going to deny the ability to even train through state schools future doctors on how to perform abortions, which is essentially denying them the ability to learn in medical practice. And there were quite a few schools, medical schools, that were involved in pushing back against that, and that provision was removed from the bill. So I think we see them engage, but I do think that the sort of retribution and vindictiveness is a real concern, and it prevents the schools from being able to engage maybe as fully as they could in the political process.
Yes.
Have you found sort of in your roles in public sphere and like also being partisan, constructive ways to communicate with people who hold wildly opposing views from you? Just because like that's something that we've been noticing here a lot too, especially after the election. Like it just begins to feel a little bit like an echo chamber, and like people are talking past each other, and like you see things from Trump where he's like, you know, anything that's against me is a fake news poll. So it's like you're not even having a conversation anymore.
That's a very, very, very important question, and but it's a challenge. I had to sit down with 5 evangelical ministers, and it was very interesting, and I learned a lot from that experience, and I think I made a little bit of progress in that. By the end of the session, they really felt bad that I was going to burn in hell forever, but that was not so much the case when we started. So I am trying to be better this year about reaching out. But it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. I had an experience recently. I was at a fundraiser for a nonprofit in Asheville. It was at a $14 million house. I mean, gorgeous house. And the hosts were very nice to me, and they introduced me as the senator from Buncombe County. And afterwards, a woman came up to me and said, "Oh, Terry, I'm so sorry I can't vote for you, but I vote in Florida." And I said, "Well, that's okay, but I would appreciate it if you would tell your friends I'm not the devil." And she said, "You're a Democrat?" And I just, it's, that's kind of where we are. That, and so I am, if you've got any ideas, I would love to know how to do that better, because you are absolutely right, and it's a struggle, because I have a new senator in my delegation who happens to be a Republican, and I swear I went up to him when he started, and I offered him some help from my legislative attorney, or my legislative assistant, who's very, very experienced. I try to include him in everything that has to do with Buncombe County, because he represents a tiny bit of Buncombe County. And I found out from a lobbyist today that he thinks I don't like him and being mean to him. And I thought, but we come with these preconceived notions, and I think we have to kind of recognize that it's not enough to just be nice. That we have to overcome that preconceived notion that because I'm a Democrat, I'm the devil, or because he's a Republican, I shouldn't have to include him. And I'm trying, but I'm happy if send me an email if there's somewhere I can show up and talk to people who maybe, because I don't want to be in that echo chamber. I really don't. I see things very clearly, but maybe wrong. So, yeah, I need your help.
Sarah?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about my ACLU experience. The ACLU is actually nonpartisan, but is probably viewed as quite progressive in the legislature. So we took strides to try to identify places where we have some common ground. One example is that a lot of Republicans get very nervous about the idea, not all, but a lot, about government surveillance. and particularly unwarranted government surveillance, say through the use of surveillance drones or surveillance cameras. So we actually actively pursued legislation that we weren't sure we could ever get through, to try and require a search warrant basically for the use of some of these surveillance technologies, which sounds pretty basic, but there's not a law like that on the books, so it seemed reasonable to pursue it. It would have been a great thing to pass, but the thing that it really did was open some doors with some Republicans and get us in the door. All of the bills that we filed that were around government surveillance had bipartisan sponsorship. And we were able to really develop and have some conversations about that common ground, which led us to a place, not always, but with some people, that led us to a place where we could sit down and talk about things like House Bill 2 or LGBT equality, where there was a divide, but maybe there was some agreement that House Bill 2 went a little too far, or something where we could continue the conversation in a less comfortable place. And so I guess what I would suggest is trying to find something where you do have some agreement and understand that you might have to compartmentalize at first your conversation, and focus on the thing you agree on before you're able to build enough relationship and rapport to move on to those things that you don't agree on. But I think you can get there. And we had a Lillian's List training this weekend. It was an engagement training in Raleigh after the march. And we had a presenter who was talking, she was actually a daughter of an immigrant and has a younger brother who was supporting Tea Party candidates. And she, had lots and lots of conversations with him, but the point of her story, and he eventually changed his mind, but the point of her story was don't discard people because they don't agree with you, even when they seem really far gone. You never know what moment or what action or what issue might get them to start to see your point of view. And for her younger brother, it was when Republicans started to talk about taking away birthright citizenship in the 2014 election cycle. That would have affected her and her brother because they were children of immigrants. And so she was able to finally have a conversation with him about why he was supporting conservative candidates and how that was damaging to their family, like very directly damaging to their family. So I would just encourage you to keep talking and try to find something that you might be able to have a conversation around where there's some common ground and build from there.
I totally agree. I mean, many people who I've talked to about going for this legislative seat, I mean, being a judge, I don't have to listen to anyone. I can say, objection, overruled, sustained, and call it as I see it. I'm the ball and strike caller. But to go into this, the biggest advice I've had is you have to develop relationships. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you in here know each other, and you totally disagree on some things, you agree on other things, and the dialogue is so important. And we cannot just go and put our feet and head in the sand and not budge. That there is compromise. And I think probably 80% of legislation that's proposed, I mean, it's not partisan. It's how do we help? Last year, 2 years ago, we raised the age to get foster care help until they were 21 years old. I mean, how could anyone disagree with that? That wasn't a political issue. I mean, some people try and make it that way, but you're exactly right. And I think people elect legislators to go and get something done. And we have to quit legislating through the courts now. Everything's going to the courts. That's not what our democracy is supposed to be doing.
Yes.
Just continuing on that topic, one big change that has happened from my mom's generation to mine is my mom always used to read the local paper to kind of get information about the state legislature and information in the community. I'm wondering what you all see moving forward with our generation in terms of getting that information out, since a lot of us we don't read the local paper and we get our news from social media, and it's hard to get those state level stories out and disseminated in the same way that they used to be.
Where do y'all get your news? I mean, is not just Facebook. I mean, where?
I'm a PBS Morning Edition and New York Times girl, but again, that's not the local news, and so I tend to just kind of I read like the indie paper and then I follow that story onto like News and Observer, but it's not as consistent as my mom reading, I'm from Jacksonville, Florida, but my mom would read the local paper all the time, and she would just know everything that was going on. And yeah, even if I didn't subscribe to that or anyone else in here does, I don't think the majority of our generation is going to do that.
Right. Any of you read the state NNO every day? No?
Follow any of the,
Big problem.
Yeah.
do any of you follow
Well,
any of the NNO reporters on
Right.
Twitter?
Or WRAL. No.
There you go.
Where else do you go besides Facebook or links or Wall Street Journal? Okay. New York Times, Washington Post. I mean, the major news outlets. But you lose the state stuff, right? Where things are happening that affect us.
And I would hazard to guess that you are probably unusual in your reading of the Wall Street Journal for college students. I mean, maybe not, but I would think a typical college student is getting their news from Twitter, and the kids I talk to, that's where they're getting it, and that's this is a huge problem. It's a huge problem. The fact, and it's not just what's happened at the state legislature. The Citizen Times in Asheville, okay, we're a small town, all right, and we don't have the money at the Citizen Times to even cover the city council or the Buncombe County Board of Commissioners. And so who's watching the store? Just the fanatics that show up, and they come with a point of view. And so you're not going to get, and that's, I think it's a huge concern. I am very grateful for NPR and my local. I do have a local, WCQS. Asheville is a NPR station, and we do try to cover, I was on that board, we do try to cover local news, but it's a challenge because we don't have the money for a full-time news person. But you bring up I think that's I talk about nonpartisan redistricting because it's something we could do with legislation. I am not really hopeful that that's even close to solving the problem. But you bring up another huge problem, and I just simply do not know how to fix it, where news, people get it in small pieces, and it's anybody can report on the news, and so much of even our institutional news is polarized. Not good for public discourse. We are sending people to their corners in a way that's not helpful.
I would say that for the most part, people sort of in your generation, this sort of millennial and probably extending on both ends of that, are curating their own news, right? Like that's essentially what you're doing. So you're gonna get Wall Street Journal and New York Times articles because that's what you want. There might be somebody who just follows Fox reporters or follows WRAL, reporters locally. And I don't know that that's exactly a problem, except that, I heard on, I think it was maybe on Rachel Maddow or something like that, that there was one of the top stories that was shared during the election was actually a fake story. And so to me, the biggest problem is, I'm actually glad that y'all seem to be getting news from actual news sources. So I'm not gonna critique you for not reading the local news, although I think that would be wonderful. I think that really a big concern is whether people are learning or being taught to discern between false stories, fake stories, that I will not call fake news because news implies something, so I don't think those words should go together, but these false stories and actual reporting and news and facts. So what I hope in the future is that students, maybe starting in high school or younger, start to get taught how to discern between real stories and these fake stories, and that become part of how we educate people, understanding that how we're curating and reading and consuming information, because you're also all being bombarded by a lot, I'm sure. We all are, right? We have so much information coming at us and so many places to go, that if we could at least start to discern between what's true and what's not, that would be a place to start. But other than that, I would say you can follow your legislators on Twitter too. Most of them have Twitter handles, and you can start to follow things that way, but then you do have to understand that they're coming at things with a bias. But it's, at least you might be informed on what's coming up, and you can follow Capitol reporters on Twitter and start to get pieces of information about what's going on locally.
Because it's not just fake versus real, it's opinion versus fact. And it's even more difficult, I think, these days to discern what's opinion, because we get opinion now on the 6 o'clock news, and that's unfortunate. I don't see a lot of discussion anymore about ethics in journalism.
Right, so I would not be doing my job as NCAWA representative if I didn't say one of our benefits of membership, which is free, is that we actually have a lobbyist in Raleigh. We get a legislative update once a month. She emails it to us, and every 3 weeks we have a phone call. In fact, there's one on Friday. But in all seriousness, like, you get involved with these organizations, and they do put you more in touch with and get your finger more on the pulse of these things. And I think that's time, Morey.
I want to thank everybody for coming, and if we can give a round of applause for our panel.
And thank you, Rory, for setting this up.
And consider